did it for Real Moms a few weeks ago, and they loved it. So we just invited more women. I wanted to give you a couple of updates. Thanks, guys. We don't need the highlights, really. Thanks. I wanted to let you know about Grace Kids Camp is in June, and on your yellow sheet of paper, there are dates and times and things that we could use help with. I heard that we especially need photographers. But if you want to do crafts or you want to be a small group leader or check-in, there's a lot of things that they can use help with. So contact Dana Kripe, I believe. Yeah. And there's a couple little things that are coming up. We have a fitness class that we're scheduling for next month, and I believe it's going to be on Wednesdays. And I don't know if you know her, Rachel Slagle. She's a nurse that goes here. She's teaching them for free. It says it's for women only, but it's not. You can bring your husbands or your brothers or whoever for kids 10 and up. And I believe it's going to be in this room, but you'll hear more. I also wanted to introduce my volunteer team. Come on up, girls. Kathy, Deanie. Okay, this is Deanie. Come on, Tamara and Kathy. I just wanted you to see these. These women have worked for 2 years to get these events going. And they've dreamed and they've prayed over you guys, and they're excited to have you here. So if you have questions, please, please ask them. And also Cassie and Kara. Come on up, you guys. My name's Linda Flatt, and I am the associate pastor for Community Life now and Pastoral Care. And this is Kara Peabody. Kara's the director for Rooted, Life Groups, Real Moms, and everything in between. Men's, women's. Any questions? Kara's got the answer. And Cassie, she's here to introduce our guest speaker. So Dave, go ahead and come on up. Cassie's going to introduce you first.
Yes. Thank you.
Oh, wait, one more thing, ladies. After Dave's done speaking, I'm going to have the small group leaders come up here so that you know who they are. You wrote a number on your name tags. That's the small group you're going to be in. So we'll have large group teaching, and then you'll go to different areas for your small groups. So that's after Dave's done, okay? Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you. Good evening. Like Linda said, my name is Cassie, and I have the privilege of introducing your speaker for the next 5 weeks. And it is incredibly exciting, and I am thrilled for you guys to be able to walk through this journey that I was able to go through 2 years ago with Dave here at our church. So Dave Rodriguez has been in ministry for 40 years, and if you weren't aware, he was the founding pastor of Grace Church and just recently retired. And instead of going quietly into his retirement and playing golf or sleeping in or baking a lot like I know he likes to do, he decided to completely launch himself into a new ministry, and I am so grateful that he has done that. So he is doing the incredibly important work of helping people find their destiny. And he has created a new company called Destiny Works, and he helps not only individuals, but groups and organizations and corporations go through this process of discovering why they were created. And this discovery sometimes comes like a meteor, and it crashes onto you, and you have a light bulb moment, and you realize that this is why I was created. And then sometimes it's like a sunrise, and over the course of a month or two or year or two, you suddenly start realizing what you were created for. And that is actually how it has happened for me. It was 2 years ago that I went through the calling quilt, and I am just now settling into my calling with a confidence that I did not have right after I had my calling quilt. So don't be afraid if you go through this and you're like, I don't really know. I have some ideas, or I feel a stirring. That's okay. Or if you do think, oh my gosh, I know what I'm going to do. It changes my whole life. That is okay too. So I am praying that as you walk through these next 5 weeks, you allow the Holy Spirit to work in your heart through what Dave is going to tell you. And if you do that, your I guarantee that your life will change. Again, maybe like a meteor or maybe like a sunrise, but it will set you on a passion-inducing path, passion for what God has for you. And so with that in mind, I would like for you to help me welcome Dave Rodriguez.
Thank you, Cassie. She was the first. Actually, I did a small version of this a number of years ago with a few people, and then Cassie sat in front of the entire congregation, and we unpacked her entire life. So she was brave from the beginning, and I'm grateful for her. And I'm grateful for you. I really am. First of all, I should say, I want to just dive right in, but let me just say that I haven't seen some of you in a long, long time, and it is really good to see you. And I'm fully vaccinated, so I'm back at church, and anyone that's fully vaccinated, I'm good with hugs, okay? So if you're fully vaccinated, I'll hug you afterwards if you want. If not, like this past weekend, I was here, and I was in the lobby, and I walked up to somebody, and I said, "Are you fully vaccinated?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Well, I can hug you," and she went. So I don't know if that was because she's still a little freaked out or it was because of me, but I don't know what it was. All right, so here's what I'm excited about for you. In that session 1, if you want to open up your workbooks, we're just going to walk through this workbook, session 1 tonight, and then bring it back with you every week. There's going to be homework for you to do in between the weeks as we get ready for the next session. But here's what I don't want you to miss Dallas Willard's quote. This is a quote that, if there's one quote that launched me into what I'm doing right now, it's this. The late Dallas Willard, in his book, The Divine Conspiracy, which is one of my favorite books of all time, he said, "You were built to count, as water is made to run downhill. You are placed in a specific context to count in ways that no one else does. That is your destiny." Now, that quote is just like loaded with little bombs, little heavy statements. Like the first one, you were built to count. The assumption that your creation was done outside of you by someone. Now, we believe at Grace Church here, you at Grace Church believe that that was God himself that created you. Before you were born, he had an idea for you in mind. You were built by God, but not just built, but you were built to count, to matter. It is one of the most profound questions that I have interacted with people over, and that is, do I matter? What is my purpose? Why am I here? Well, Willard suggests you were built to count, and then the phrase that you not just matter in a general sense, like you're supposed to be a good person. And no, there is something really uniquely specific about you, that a way that you matter. And that's really what we're going to focus on for the next 5 weeks. And this cumulatively really leads you to discover your destiny. And there aren't many bigger words than destiny. I mean, destiny is the word that shows up in myths and legends and stories, and it is usually reserved for heroes and heroines and people who are Marvel characters, right? But it is you too. You have a destiny. And I'm going to explain the word in just a few moments. But before we dive into the idea of destiny, I want to back up. And if you've been at Grace for a while, you've heard me use this illustration, but I think it bears repeating, that we need to take a look at the fact that we all climb a first mountain as we enter into our adult life. And the first mountain, and this illustration I'm sharing with you comes from David Brooks of the New York Times, and an author. His book, The Second Mountain, is where I got the illustration. The first mountain that we all start climbing, usually in our 20s when we head off to college or we graduate from high school, is what the summit we're trying to achieve is that of identity. Trying to figure out who we are. I'm sorry if you can't see that very well, I apologize. Our identity. And when you're trying to discover your identity, you're trying to define yourself. Who am I? Or who do other people think I should be, or who am I compared to you? And there are a lot of people that spend the rest of their life asking that question, trying to continue to climb this first mountain of identity. But it's not just a mountain of identity. We're also, as Americans in particular, trying to achieve the American dream. That is also the summit of the first mountain. And the American dream is about winning and consuming. It is about success. It is about personal happiness and security, depending on who defines the term. It's usually about a nice home, a nice family, nice vacations, good food, good friends. This is what many people spend their whole life trying to achieve, trying to solidify their identity in this world, and also try to achieve the American dream. But, and you know there's a but, something inevitably happens. We'll call it disappointment. Did I spell that wrong? I probably did. And disappointment can come through pain and failure and tragedy and life change that happens to us, and sometimes just getting older. Disappointment happens. And all of a sudden, there is confusion, and what we end up being in is the valley of bewilderment. And there is great anxiety in the valley of bewilderment. It is here we wonder, what am I supposed to do? Who am I? Because we're figuring out this identity thing. We've gone through perhaps a quarter-life crisis or a midlife crisis, or approaching retirement, and all of a sudden everything has changed, and you don't. And believe me, if you want to talk about what it feels like to enter into retirement and realize life has completely changed, I'm happy to talk with you about it, because it has been. Oh, by the way, have that happen during a pandemic is a difficult transition to go through. But when we get to these transition moments, or we get, sometimes it's not pain, sometimes it's not failure, sometimes you just come to the point in your life and go, what is it all about? Who am I? And when people hit the valley of bewilderment, normally what they do, or a lot of people do, is they try to reclimb the first mountain. They think, okay, I just need to change my identity. We need to move to another city. I need to get another job. I need to change my career. Or I need to leave you. I need to break up this family, and get a divorce because I've got to change. Or they go in the other direction to get more religious. Something to reclimb the first mountain. Inevitably, it happens. But there's another option. And that is to begin the climb up the second mountain. And the second mountain is the mountain of destiny. Now, there are huge differences between the first mountain and the second mountain. Richard Rohr calls the second mountain the further and fantastic journey. I love that so much that that's the title of my blog. A further and fantastic journey. That's the second mountain. David Brooks suggests that the first mountain is, watch this, it's about acquisition. The first mountain is, I'm acquiring things and acquiring identity. I'm acquiring success. I'm trying to make myself feel good about myself. I'm acquiring. Well, that's the first mountain. The second mountain is contribution. If the first mountain is about acquisition, the second is about contribution. Another way to define the two mountains. The first mountain is about building up your ego and defining yourself, whereas the second mountain is about shedding your ego and losing yourself. Another way to describe it is the first mountain is about me, and the second mountain is about you. See the difference? And this is going to come when we start defining calling a destiny. This is really, really important. I just realized this a couple of months ago when I was doing some reading, that this second mountain, there is a simple word that we can define the act of living into your destiny, and that is love. It is love. It is self-giving love. That is second mountain living. Because you're no longer interested, when you are climbing the second mountain, you are no longer interested in what people tell you you should be. On the second mountain, you now start to want the things that are worth wanting. And on the second mountain, it is no longer about you. It's about the call on your life. Now, here's the question that brings us to this moment. If it's that important, and clearly, the way I defined the second mountain, it's something we want, right? So, can you find it? If Willard is right, that you were built to count and placed in contexts that are specific to you, can you figure that out? I hope so, because we're going to spend 5 weeks talking about that and helping you figure it out. And like Cassie said, I don't know, the majority of the people, I've done this in workshops and I do this with dozens of people one-on-one in personal coaching, and I don't know whether it's, the majority of the people are like Cassie in that it's something that, a new dawn, like you understand yourself a little bit better. And then about 20% of the people I work with have some sort of, it is like a game changer. It's explosive. And I've had people that I've walked through this, quit their jobs, go back to school, and start pursuing the call of God in their life. I've had people determined to throw themselves into things that they've held off for so long because they didn't think they were allowed to do the thing that they've really been passionate about, and now they're doing it, right? Well, I don't know what it's going to be for you, but at the end of our time, at the end of 5 weeks, I really hope that something will at least dawn on you to get you thinking differently about yourself and about your impact on the world. Now, what is true about discovering a calling is that it can be found, I think we're on the next page of the workshop here, but I'm not positive. It can be found at the intersection of two massive truths. And the first truth is awesome, and the second truth is awful. The awesome truth is about you. In Ephesians 2:10, there's a little composite of the awesome truth that you are God's masterpiece, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for you to do. So you are awesome, and you are a masterpiece. Now, as you're going to see, as we go through these 5 weeks, the aspects of who you are, we're going to take essentially 1 week at a time. Because there are 4 major aspects of your life that we are going to examine, or you are going to examine and discuss with your friends. And the first is your life story. Now, your life story is the composite of the people, good people, who have influenced you and helped you think clearly about who you are, people who have mentored you and people who have inspired you, and people, frankly, that probably are, you want to emulate with your life. People, good people. It also, your life story, has some bad people in it. People that have hurt you, people that have abused you, people that have disappointed you. And what you're going to see next week is we're going to talk about how even the bad people can lead you to your destiny. Okay? And we're going to see how it is that the years that the locusts have taken can be redeemed. All right? So your life story is about people. Your life story is about circumstances. The good the bad, the wondrous, and the ugly. And of course, the good circumstances, the things that you always predicate by saying, I will never forget it when, or this was the most important, or every time you think of it, you tear up, there's some emotions. We have wonderful circumstances and experiences. They could be brief conversations to months-long dive into something. These circumstances that shape your destiny, your calling in powerful ways. We also have awful circumstances that sometimes we don't think of. We don't even want to think about them. But I'll show you next week how, and I'll give you a little preview of next week. The Apostle Paul says something in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. He says this. He says, the comfort that we've received from God, comfort that I've received from God, he says, is the comfort that I deliver to you. So in other words, the awful circumstances that Paul went through, God shaped him through it in a way that he understood what it meant to go through that in such a way that he could then deliver that to other people in the comfort. And similarly, now I've been doing this process with groups and with individuals for 3 years. I was doing it even before I retired from Grace. And I'll tell you that the vast majority of the people probably never thought that the hard points of their life actually helped shape their calling. And then they've discovered that the way they're moving into the world is actually a reaction because God has comforted them through it. And their calling very much can be tied back to their broken place. I've seen so many people dissolve into tears when they realize, really, it could actually have some positive impact on my life. And absolutely, the answer is yes. So life story is about people. It's about it's also about groups and teams and churches that have shaped you in ways. We'll spend all next week talking about life story. But that's only one aspect, one element of your life. The second element of your life is your personality. You're going to take the Enneagram. If you've not taken the Enneagram, it is the personality test that I prefer. And it's extremely helpful because your personality gauges your motivations, how you think, how you feel, why you think the way you do, why the way you feel the way you do. Personality is absolutely huge. What you're going to see is whereas life story tends to point to your calling, personality tends to show you how you're going to go about doing your calling. Okay? As does your skill set. Now, when I talk about skill set, this is everything from the innate skills that you seem to have possessed even when you were 2 years old, to the skills that you've picked up along the way, and even to spiritual gifts that you received, you feel like you have when the Holy Spirit entered into your life. We'll call this your skill set or your gifts or your talents. Those three make up who you are, as does the fourth element, and that's your passions. Now, I'm going to define passions in a few minutes, but passions really are the fire in your bones. A lot of people have not processed the fire in their bones. They maybe haven't even thought that they are allowed to operate from the fire in their bones, but it's as equally important in discovering your destiny as life story, personality, skill set. And so when we get to the end, by the end of the month, we'll be talking about passions. So this is the awesome truth. You are placed in a specific context with a unique life story, a unique personality, a unique skill set, and unique passions. That's the awesome truth. Then there's the awful truth. And the awful truth is about the world. And the world is broken. Can I get an amen? Amen? Thank you. You know, by the time I retired, you guys really hadn't come around to be able to do the call and response thing. And I'm just severely disappointed in that. So for Barry's sake, can you learn how to do that? Okay, I'm doing that on the front row, and I feel really awkward doing that since I'm his dad. So somebody join me, okay? Somebody help a brother out here. Okay, the world is broken in 6 distinct ways. I wonder if you could tell me what they are. I'm not going to ask you to do it, but hopefully by now you know what the 6 broken places are. Injustice. I'll just give you one example. You've experienced these kind of things too. It was a number of years ago on a mission trip to South Africa to experience what was happening at the height of the AIDS crisis. I felt like I had a tsunami of injustice I had to take in, and just in a 24-hour period. In the morning, we went to a mass grave where they were dumping bodies out of dump trucks into mass graves because people couldn't afford a funeral. So I stood there and experienced that, and in the afternoon, went out to a village not too far away. This was in the Valley of Thousand Hills near Durban, South Africa, and where there were a lineup of about 40 or 50 kids waiting to get their one meal of the day. And the reason why they only got one meal a day, all their parents were dead. They had no one to care for them. And one young man who had a destiny and a call in his life, his name was Sianda, and he was 22 years old, and he essentially gave himself to scrounging around to find enough food to feed the 50 kids in his village. And I saw 2 things. I saw injustice in a powerful way, and I saw a calling in a powerful way. It was amazing. So injustice, I'm just using it as an example. It could be poverty, human trafficking, abortion, those vast injustices in the world. And then there's isolation. Everybody in the front row is thankful that I've been fully vaccinated because I'm spitting like mad up here. Okay. Isolation is essentially it's loneliness. It's another way to describe loneliness. It is being apart from people. Did you know that 1 out of every 2 Americans, 50% of Americans, will tell you that they largely have no one to talk to in any way at a level of depth that they need? 1 out of every 2 Americans are somewhat isolated. Now let's throw a pandemic into that. And we have a tsunami of isolation. And I think you probably know this, but especially those of you in the medical field, do you know the impact of isolation? If you're isolated for any period of time, your blood pressure will go up. You'll experience a high level of cardiovascular disease. Cognitive decline becomes commonplace. Depression, of course, reduced immunity, inflammation, and poor sleep. These are all the results of isolation. This is a broken place. Then there's hatred. We are experiencing that in... this has been a terrible time for this broken place and destroying lives. And hatred starts simply with me looking at you or somebody and going, well, that's me, and it's an us and them thing. You're different than me. And I prefer to be with people who are like me, and I'm suspicious of people who are not like me. And that level of suspicion lends to segregation, as in, and I'm not going to have anything to do with you. And segregation then leads to bigotry. You're not like me, but I don't like you. And ultimately, it leads to dehumanization, where I don't like you, I don't want to be with you, I'm going to be apart from you. And by the way, you're less than human. And the end game of hatred is always genocide of some kind, always. Because when somebody goes from human being to bug, it's easy to squash them. It's easy to kill somebody who you think is less than human. Hatred. Then there's pain. Now, there's all kinds of physical pain. I don't need to state the obvious. Cancer, diabetes, heart disease, dementia, chronic discomfort, pandemics. But in addition to physical pain, 1/4 of all Americans suffer from significant mental illness in a given year, and I really think that number's low. That's what the stats say. The reason why I think it's low is because most people who struggle with some sort of... When I talk about mental illness, I'm not talking about schizophrenia, I'm not talking about multiple personalities, I'm talking about depression and anxiety. Those are forms, those are neuroses. Not psychoses, but neuroses. They're part of the pain of Americans today. and a quarter of Americans have it, and probably half because other people don't report it or they just try to grind through it. Interesting research done out of USC, Southern Cal. They studied the mental state of students, let's say teens into the early 20s, in 1950, and the same age kids today in the early 2000s. What they discovered when they compared the mental state of kids, young men and women today, they compared to those young men and women in 1950 who were institutionalized. So the level of anxiety and depression in 20-somethings today, if you were living in 1950, they would put you in a home. They put you somewhere. And yet today, we're all struggling to a certain extent, including me, with a level of depression and anxiety. But by the way, for the first time, I did a sermon on this once about how I struggle with depression. And then the pandemic hit, and lo and behold, now there's anxiety too. And I don't like either of them. So pain. Then there's decay of the planet. Now for you older folks like me, you know, when I was growing up in western Pennsylvania, in the steel town of western Pennsylvania, you weren't allowed to talk about the tree-hugging idea of caring for the planet, even though I could stand on the bridge near my town of New Kensington, the Allegheny River, and watch pollution float down all day long. It was bad. Today, we're not dealing with just pollution. We're dealing with species extinction. We're dealing with desertification of the planet, of the loss of forest, and of course global warming. Decay of the planet is an issue, and it's time for the Church of Jesus Christ to rise up and take our place on the front lines of dealing with that broken place. And then finally, I used to refer to this last one as separation, but I'm now referring to it as alienation. And alienation, in particular, from God, separated from the God of the universe. But also, I discovered a word in the last year that I'd never heard before. It's called anomie, A-N-O-M-I-E. And it's the feeling of being disconnected from something solid or from norms, things that you perceive to be norms in this world. And it is a major issue, especially with young folks who feel a sense of anomie, not only if they're not followers of Jesus, they're disconnected from the God of the universe, but they're also alienated from what they thought were the norms of society. And the research has shown the more you experience anomie, the more likely you are going to go to a fringe group. The more likely you are going to identify with something on the edges of culture. Because you need to find something, no matter how ridiculous it is, no matter how confusing it is, you will grab onto it because it gives you a sense of belonging. Alienation. Those are the broken places of this world. Now, where they intersect, the awesome truth and the awful truth. Remember, the awesome truth is about you. The awful truth is about the world. And if you take this, your life story, your personality, your skill set, and your passions, the uniqueness of you, and it overlaps with the brokenness of the world, right there is your calling and your destiny. Now, I just used those two words together, calling and destiny. So maybe we should do some word definitions so we know what we're talking about here. By the way, when I get to the end, and I don't have too much longer to go, I'm going to open up for questions. And we're going to have a microphone because we're recording this for people who cannot be here. And I'd like you to ask your questions. I'll do my best to address them. And I know they're going to be pretty general right now, or they even may be more specific. And I'll say something like, well, we'll cover that in 3 weeks, or we'll cover that in 2 weeks. But I want you to have the opportunity because, I'm dumping a load of things on you. And I want you to be able to ask questions. All right. how do we describe what is destiny? What is calling? I want to cover some terms with you, and it's really important you listen now because we'll come back at the end, and you're going to have to work through the concepts of these words. And the first word is job. I think we're on the next page of the workbook. Keep going. Clarification of terms. All right. Job is something you do in which you earn money. Now, a job is something you can like or you can despise. A job is something that you can enjoy or not enjoy, and a job can be something that you're good at or not good at. But how does job, regardless how you feel about your job, how does it intersect with calling? In a couple minutes, I'll show you it intersects with calling, job intersects with calling in one of three ways. Similarly, career. Now, career is a series of jobs strung together over a period of time that usually start to look like it's in a general area, like a career in medicine, a career in retail sales, a career in education. That is a career. Now, similarly, the question is, how does a calling intersect with a career? Can they be one and the same? Well, I'm going to show you three ways that calling can intersect with career. I'll get that in a minute. But before we do, let's talk about role. Now, I want you to listen very carefully to this because this is where a lot of people get confused. Role is essentially the relationships you play or the relationships you have with other people, like husband, wife, mother, father, brother, sister, cousin, friend. Those are roles. Now, a role is not your calling. Now, your calling can interact with your role, but they're distinct. Let me give you an illustration, and you would understand this more than I would, and that is a mom who raises children, a mom who has little children. Many times, if you ask a mom with little children, what's your calling, they would tell you, well, to keep these kids safe and get them an education and get them out on their own. The problem is that when they get out on their own, you're freaked out. Not just because they're leaving you, but because you wonder, who am I now? Who am I? That's because calling is distinct from role. And there are a lot of people that I have worked with who find that to be an unbelievable relief as they realize, okay, yes, for those years, I invested so much of my time with my children, and that's the beautiful thing, because roles are God-given. Don't hear me, I'm not trying to say that roles are less than calling. They're equally important, they're God-given. But roles change, and when roles change, especially when a person goes through a divorce, or children move out of the house, or when a spouse dies, there is a massive crisis in that human being, because now they are unmoored from what they thought was their calling and their purpose. Okay? All right, let's move on. That gets us to the word calling. Now, calling, in short, is a summons. It comes from outside of you, because the word call, we know what that is. Somebody is calling someone else. Well, the somebody that we believe is calling us is God himself. It's a summons that he's issuing to you and to me that is unique to us. And a calling, many times, and you'll see this when we get to the last week, next to the last week, many times callings emerge out of passions that burn in our bones. But I want to make a really clear distinction about something. I'm going to tell you one of my passions. One of my passions is cooking. Okay? I love to cook. I really do. There were times during the pandemic where I didn't want to cook another thing as long as I lived. But I love to cook, and I love to bake. I'm not as good as many of you are. That's not my calling. That's my hobby. So a passion that results in my benefit or me feeling better about myself or enjoying life, they're wonderful, those kind of passions, but they're hobbies. But a passion that is directed outwards, and by the way, let me step back. Maybe yours is crocheting, maybe it's mountain biking, maybe it's skiing, maybe it's swimming, maybe it's it's not your calling, that's your hobby, and that's fine. But a passion that's directed outward to one of the broken places of the world or people who are struggling, now that's a calling. Now, I told you that callings intersect job and career in one of three ways. The first way that this summons on your life can interact with your job is that it doesn't. They're completely separate. Here's the greatest illustration of all time is the Apostle Paul, the number one missionary of all time. His job was making tents. That had nothing to do with his calling except that it financed his calling. All right? And that's where a lot of people, they get freaked out thinking, well, I've got to change. You don't necessarily have to change your job or your career to live out your calling, but you do have to understand that because you have a job and a calling, and for that matter, a role, the amount of time that you can engage in your calling may be a little more limited. But it's perfectly fine for them to be totally unrelated. That's the one way that calling intersects with job. The second way that calling intersects with job is they touch. At times they overlap. There's a connection, sometimes a big connection, sometimes a little connection. Here's two illustrations. Anybody in the room, if you're a nurse, I'll use that for the third one. If you're an educator. I just met with a woman last Monday. I did her personal calling quilt with her. She's an educator, and at the end of the time, she realized her calling was specifically, she works with she's a special ed teacher, and she loves these kids, especially she has an eye for those who grew up in deep poverty and were struggling with life. And so as an educator, that's where she wanted to spend the most time and energy with those kids. But she had to also teach them, right? And so she did her job as a teacher, but her calling of intersecting with kids who have deep needs, she was able to do as an educator. Here's another illustration. I've got a friend, again, I walked him through this process. His calling, he discovered, was he's this uber mentor. I had lunch with him the other day, and I walk away after like an hour with this dude, and I'm like, I can take on the world. I mean, he's like this uber mentor that he just asked me a few questions. I was like, yeah, I could do that. But he is the president of a software company. And then he realized, wait a minute, I have that impact on people. I can have that impact on my employees and on my customers. And so his calling touches on his career and his job. So, your calling can be completely distinct from your job. Your calling can touch on your job and career. And the third way is when your calling completely subsumes your job and career. In other words, you vocationalize your calling. And I'm an illustration of that. My calling consists of doing this right here. And what I'm doing, I've made it my life vocation at this point. And it completely overwhelms. And a better illustration than me is a nurse or a doctor who would tell you that they have always struggled with pain and they want to help people with pain. And they went into a career where that's all they do all day long. And so their career and their calling completely overlap. All right, that's calling. Then there's destiny. Destiny is calling on steroids. Destiny is calling for people who are aging. In other words, the older you get, the more your calling starts to look like a destiny. Because what I've noticed with people, when you're young, in your 20s, and a lot of 20-somethings, and one of the parts of my business is that I'm working with a fraternity, and I'm doing this workshop with 20-somethings all over the country. They have a hard time with the word destiny because it's too big for them. They kind of get calling. Mostly they understand purpose. Okay? And so what happens is when you're in your 20s, it feels like I want to live on purpose. But then they get in their 30s and they say, no, wait a minute. I want to have, it gets to be a little more defined. And then their 40s gets a little more defined. By the way, when you're going through an age change like some of you are from one era to another, that's why you're struggling with this subject, because you're starting to refine the older you get. And then when you get to be ancient, like my age, what's that?
I said easy.
Easy, yeah. Easy, sorry. Present company left out of this, just me, okay? When you get to be my age, I don't want to just live on purpose. I want to invest as much time and my life and my heart in a way that feels like a destination. Okay? That's what a destiny is. Essentially, it's the same word as calling, but it's on steroids. I had a young man, one of the first times I did this on stage, there was a young man, he was like 28 years old, and he said, I want to know my destiny. I said, well, I can't tell you. He said, well, that's why I'm here. I want to know I said, I can't tell you your destiny. I can help you figure out your calling. He said, well, that's not good enough. I want to know dude, you're not old enough. You haven't had enough of your life story yet to really know what your destiny is going to be. All right, final word is legacy. And legacy is what happens behind you when you live out your calling. It's the people who are changed. It is the world that is changed. And when you start living into your calling, the summons on your life, your legacy starts piling up behind you. And you don't even know it until you look back. And most of us don't look back on our legacy. But I guarantee if you work in your calling, your legacy will grow like mad. All right. I'm anxious to move on with you on this, but I want to tell you that I think, let me get my notes here. I have watched the lights go on in so many people's lives as they discovered their calling and their destiny. Former NFL football players, leadership teams, fraternity guys, 16-year-old high school girl, 82-year-old widow, done it all. And it is beautiful to watch it unpack. But how are we going to do it? How are we going to discover it? Well, that's where the calling quilt comes in. You have one in your book, then that's going to be, it's going to contain your whole life. Now, you have a quilt. I'm sure many of you have a quilt. Grandma made it for you, or maybe you made it. A quilt is pieces of fabric that are sewn together, and sometimes they can be completely different pieces of fabric and could be purple with red with yellow or stripes with polka dot. Doesn't really matter. They can be sewn together and it makes a whole. My daughter has a t-shirt quilt. Anybody have a t-shirt quilt? You know what I'm talking about? So she accumulated, like a lot of 20-somethings, accumulated dozens of t-shirts from all the organizations she was a part of. So what she did was cut out the logos from the t-shirts and made them all into a quilt. So that if we hung her quilt, by the way, it's pretty ugly, the quilt. Sorry, Lucy. Don't tell, by the way, they're moving back here, so when you see her in church, don't tell her I said that. But you can look at her quilt and you can go, oh, you went to Indiana University. Oh, and you were in the Kelley School of Business. Oh, you were a DG. You were in sorority. Oh, and you loved cycling and you loved music and you were in theater. So you get a picture of my daughter's life just by looking at her quilt. This is what's going to happen to you in the next 5 weeks. What we're going to do is we're going to start, as we tell your life story, you're going to put little patches, this person, this circumstance, this person, this circumstance, this life-changing thing, and you'll start listing all these on your calling quilt, and then we'll get to your personality and we'll add these characteristics of your personality and these characteristics, they'll be placed here, and then we'll talk about your skill set and then we'll finally get down to your passions. And then when we get done with this whole thing, we connect the dots. And I'm going to give you some questions and hopefully some direction to help you connect the dots. And I can almost promise you that something's going to emerge that either you've known all along, but it's confirmed, or it's something you never thought of before. When we connect the dots, your calling quilt is going to be the composite of your life. So, there it is. I want to stop before we wrap up and talk about next week and see what questions you have. So, do we have the microphone? We're going to get the microphone. And if you wouldn't mind, so that we know where to go, raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone to you so the people watching at home could hear the same questions. Anybody have a question about all this, which I just brought the semi in and dumped it on you tonight? Any questions? Yes?
I'm looking for my note here.
Oh, okay. Get your note.
What was the first of the three things?
The
three.
ways that calling interacts with job?
Yeah.
They don't.
Okay, that's why I didn't get it.
Yeah, they don't. They're completely separate.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you.
They separate, they touch, or they overlap. Did somebody else have a question? Yes.
I don't have the microphone, but my question is, what is the difference between destiny and purpose?
In my definitions, I would say it's the same thing.
Okay.
In terms of intensity of word, purpose, calling, destiny.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's essentially the same thing. Other questions?
I spent a lot of time last fall kind of going through this and took the Enneagram test and everything. And where I struggle is I was so blessed growing up that I can't think of something that's awful, like what's blocking me from, because I'm sure there's something that shaped me. And so do you have any recommendations of how to like dig deeper into yourself to help find those things that may be affecting who you are now?
That's a good question, and as you go over the next week, this is going to be important. First of all, you may not have any bad thing that happen, and you thank God, but as you consider your life, when you're considering your life story, don't just list the things. Ask this question of the people and the things. What did it do for me, in me, or what did it shape in me? The positive, if you grew up in a family that was deeply loving and caring, what did that shape in you? What became important to you as a result of that, for instance? As for unpacking, I'm not a counselor, okay? So there are ways to do that. There are probably ways that other people have gone through to do that. The thing is, if the word pain and tragedy doesn't impact you, think of the word disappointment. Where in my life was I disappointed? Either in myself or in somebody or the situation. And that tends to unlock when that word is a little more accessible. Okay? So look for that. Yeah. Wait, let's get the mic over here.
So how many times can you go up and down this mountain? And does it ever stop, or you just keep going up and down the mountain? And how do you do that?
I think it's possible to go up and down the mountain because especially when we're struggling, our default is to climb the first mountain again. I need to do something where I have something happen to me or I get something for myself. That's our default. That's just the way we are. So the tendency is to go back there. But I maintain, and then sometimes if a person, especially if a person has not considered their calling and their destiny, the tendency of going back up the first mountain, it's going to happen more often. But I contend that a person who begins to work through their calling and destiny, the trip back up mountain number one doesn't happen or doesn't happen very often. When you start living with a sense of purpose, even pain, failure, tragedy, life change, and getting older, once you start in destiny, it doesn't have the same impact on you. It hurts. It's confusing. It's bewildering. But you go right back to that thing where you love. That's what I think.
Dave, with the people that you've worked with, has there been a theme of how people get out of bewilderment and then start pursuing their calling? Are there things that happen or a mind shift, but what prevents them?
What prevents them from doing that?
Or I guess, what motivates them to go towards that second mountain and not reclimb?
It's almost like a conversion. And I don't want to be overstate it, but a person has to go through almost a conversion that says, if Jesus were here, he is, but if he were here, he would say, when you're ready to take up your cross, then you start climbing the second mountain, because it's always self-giving. It's always a loving thing. So I think it's pretty dramatic when a person moves in that direction. That's why most people don't, because it requires so much of an inner change in a person. But I will say, on another level, I've talked with people who have started to move into their calling, like the Uber mentor guy, the catalyst. When I walked through this with him, he started to weep, and he said, that's why I enjoy mentoring so much. So what he was doing, he was living on the second mountain, but had never identified it. So sometimes a person is doing that, and even some of you would think, you're probably thinking, well, I've been living with my calling for a long time. But when you identify it, doesn't even have more power. So that's what
It sounds like the importance of people and community,
Oh.
and just having that intimacy with God that can
Absolutely.
help you.
And
Yep.
a community that cheers us on and says, especially when you get to the skills, it's important to let people say to you, this is what I see in you. Essentially, that's what I do. That's my job right now, is saying to people, here's what I see in you. And they're like, really? Because everybody wants to know what other people see in them, right? Thank you. It's a great question. Up front again? Sorry. Or somebody back here? Okay. Linda, I want to be careful about time. We're 5 minutes. All right. We'll take 2 more questions, and I'll answer them quickly.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about the concept of anomie?
Yeah.
And how it might relate to, empowerment, or the contrary, disenfranchisement,
Yeah.
and lead to believing in conspiracy theories, or
The last thing you said was
and
what?
like how it might lead to believing in conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories. Okay, I'm not an expert in this. I'm a learner in anomie. This is a new concept for me. But what I've learned, or what I'm learning, is when a person is, again, when the norms of their life have been kicked out from underneath them, the sense of falling away or being empty or having no connection is so strong that you will sometimes reach out to things that you would have never considered before, because what it does is gives you a grounding. And that's what I understand about it, is that, and some people actually do that with spiritual things, and that's how they come to God. And it's not actually the best way to come to God, because it's usually out of some, don't get me wrong, it's great to come to God. The idea of desperation and grasping at something is not, and yes, conspiracy theories, that can be one thing, or, far left fringe groups, far right fringe groups.
Because as you were speaking, a verse kept coming to my mind in Acts 17, where it talks about how God placed us, each one of us, He set our boundaries and our lifespans, the duration of our lives.
Right.
So that we will reach out and seek Him and
Uh-huh.
find Him, so that
Yep.
we will, grasp at Him. And so I think that that's kind of what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
If we have something other than Christ as our basis, then we're going to be vulnerable.
Right. Somebody described you've heard the old phrase, the hole in our hearts. I like the term the great lack. When a person experiences the great lack, or another person described it as when they're looking for the thing that seems to be insisting on their life, but they can't name it. If we're there to introduce them to the one who insists, we take them out of alienation to God. That's a great question. This would be a great discussion to have. One more question?
Thank you. This is kind of with that same concept. If I'm understanding this, so when people are having this big disconnect and they're trying, and everything's been taken away, like, or that's just their life circumstance, like belonging to a gang.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Same concept. Joining a gang, yeah. It's the same concept. It gives them a sense of belonging.
Okay. That's the missing piece right there. Missing. Thank you.
All right. I think I'm done talking. I think you're going to, I'll turn it back over to Linda, and you'll get your homework for next week, but you're working on your life story in the meantime, and I'll be back next week, and we'll go there. Okay?
Thank you. Okay, next, can I have all the small group leaders come up here so I can introduce you to your groups and tell you where you're going to be? So look at the number on your name tag, please. Number 1. If you're number 1 group, this is Christina Pantaleo and Brooke Carnes will be your small group leaders. Christina is going to go take her group upstairs to the far corner. Group number 2, Rhonda. Rhonda, you are in pod B, middle pod right there. Group number 3 is Gail Kemp and Judy Pippin, and they are in this pod right back here, pod C. Christine Wagner is group number 4, and you're upstairs in the first circle. Group number 5 is Patty Rail and Lynn Cheever right here, and you guys are in conference room 1. Group number 6, Melissa and Joanna Burris, and you guys are in conference room 1. The light needs to turn on. And group number 7 is Deanie. There's Deanie. You guys are in pod A, very first pod. You guys good with that? So next week, you're going to know your pods, and the timing will be a little bit different since you're all signed in and everything. You can grab a name tag when you come. Don't forget to do your homework, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, ladies. Questions? Here first next time.
I left everything on because I had to come down.
Yeah, that's fine. Can you go stop the recording? Conference room 1. In the hallway, the same place you were. Taylor, I'm going to take you. So, Taylor, okay. We're going to go this way, and we're